right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the April 3rd Thursday Web Forum. Or actually, this is May, isn't it? Spring's getting away from me. It's the May 3rd Thursday Web Forum. My name's Hilary Morris. As always, I work on Blueprint user support and communications for the South Atlantic Blueprint. And we host this Web Forum every third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. to give folks a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the conservation future of our region. So most of you who are regulars are probably familiar with this slide, but it's our usual agenda. I always start out by introducing the speaker, then we have our main talk. We leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. We'll preview next month's webinar and share some updates for Blueprint staff, and then open the floor again for any more discussion. So I am going to put us in silent mode today so we don't have a lot of background noise, which means if you need to speak up at any time, you'll just press *6 to unmute your line, or you can always post questions using the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on that throughout the presentation. So before I mute everybody, does anyone need to speak up with questions or concerns?
The conference is now in silent mode.
All right, so Rua is going to be our speaker today. You probably already know him as the science coordinator in the South Atlantic. He's going to be going over the improvements that are in the works for both the Southeast and the South Atlantic blueprints. Rua?
Hey, everybody. So this should be pretty fun, talking about new stuff in the works. I'm going to go grab the presenter power from Hilary here with my magical powers. All right. So, as Hilary mentioned, we're going to be talking about improvements on the way for the Southeast and the South Atlantic blueprint. So, as many of you might know, as we've been building that user base of folks using the South Atlantic blueprint, there's been more and more demand for uses across entire states or across larger regions of just the South Atlantic. So over the last few years, we've been working not just on improving the South Atlantic part, but also improving integration and more broader products across the entire Southeast as part of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or CCAS. So I'm going to actually be talking about improvements for both, and since they're integrated, it kind of counts for both as well. All right, here's the stuff I was going to talk about. First off, some associated data layers, so things like indicators and other data products that we have on the way for into the fall. As you probably can tell, because you probably read ahead on this slide already, blueprint priority maps will likely not change for this fall, probably another one next year. If you were at the latest blueprint workshops, you remember we talked a lot about this. Do we do every year? Do we do every other year? And the trade-off between running the whole new blueprint versus spending more time on new indicators. And it was about split. So we're pretty much at the point where probably not enough stuff ready to rerun the blueprint just yet, but we do have a lot of cool stuff that we're going to release earlier than that that will be built into a future version of the blueprint. And the other section I wanted to talk about is the Southeast-wide integrations. So you're familiar with that Southeast blueprint, but also we have a number of different sort of requests and components we're working on as part of that CCAS strategy, including things like breaking out just the hubs and corridors of the strategy, some new stuff beyond just the blueprint of integrating ecosystem assessments to help aid in goal setting, and also threat layers across the South. So I'll talk a little bit about those as well. So that is the plan. I'm going to start off on some associated data layers. One layer that's really close, almost ready for the second round of review by the Greenways and Trails team, is this new Greenways and Trail indicator. This is a picture showing part of Raleigh and the area just west into Cary, all those sort of green areas, capturing those. So this indicator is really meant to capture some of the recreational value and the ability to connect people and nature of greenways and trails throughout the South Atlantic and actually throughout the entire Southeast. So it incorporates both sort of connected length of the trails and connectivity, and also the condition of the greenway itself. So this is something that what actually took us so long is that we're running it across the entire Southeast instead of just within the South Atlantic, and that's pretty much resulted in breaking ArcGIS and support tickets, and the point of our GIS coordinator, Amy, who many of you know, actually switching and running this in grass So quite a lot of adventures doing things at large scales, but we think we've got that tamed, hoping to get that out to the team maybe by next week, and maybe in not the next newsletter, but the newsletter out after that, releasing this indicator more broadly for everyone to use. Very excited about it. One thing I wanted to talk about real quickly related to this indicator is how we're dealing with the condition of the Greenway out south. So we have the overall connected length, but we're also looking at this, the condition of the Greenway. And so what we're doing is we're looking at it through both local impervious and nearby impervious surface. So here's your sort of conceptual Greenway with the house and trees along it. And so what we're doing is basically looking at the condition at a more local layer, this sort of like 30-meter pixel area. So that's your immediate, how you're experiencing, right, where you're standing in place and what you see closest to you. And then also combining that with this nearby impervious, which is kind of like a cone or more of a tube around the Greenway itself, going 300 meters in either direction through this moving pixel kind of approach. But basically, it's looking at that overall experience. So in this case, yes, you're mostly natural in this area, but you still, if you go back 300 meters, you see that person's house and some other experiences like that. So we're combining both of those to look at the overall condition of the Greenway, getting some really cool results on that one. So short teaser on that, more probably in the next newsletter on the Greenway indicator, but very excited about that one, especially having it across the entire South. And theoretically, if people are interested, it's something could actually do nationally, so it could be expanded to the Northeast or parts farther west as well. All right, that's a little teaser on Greenways. The other big thing doing a lot of relates to mapping the military mission, kind of military priorities and things like that. You might have read in the last newsletter, just released the military training route data for pretty much for the nation, because we could do it at that scale. So these are those low, fast-flying areas that are particularly important for keeping dark for the military, and where you have a lot of compatible benefits between conservation, keeping the land dark, and the darkness needed for training and security. Expect to see more military mission layers coming up soon, working very closely with the Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability that includes state, federal organizations, but also a lot of high-level representation by the armed forces. So already a core part of their team for mapping fire priorities, but now actually, as of the last meeting, going to be doing even more integration into other components, combining conservation and the missions of the various partners, including the military mission footprint. So this is the first of probably a number of other layers that we'll be able to release, looking at places where conservation can also benefit the military mission. So lots of cool stuff in the works on that front. Now, I want to go ahead and skip and jump to the Southeast-wide integration. Those two things I mentioned were pretty clear. We've got a bunch of other indicator stuff in the works that I'll talk about in a little bit. The next thing, especially for the confident on the fall update, is some of these Southeast-wide integrations. So many of you are familiar with the Southeast Blueprint. This is basically for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. The South Atlantic Blueprint is basically the South Atlantic part of that component. So that's the blueprint itself. But there's a few things folks have really wanted beyond just that. One, the ability to kind of carve that up and find their part of the blueprint itself. And also, additional layers and other components for the strategy beyond just the priority map. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those things. The first thing just started working on is actually pulling out hubs and corridors. So of that broader area, a lot of people like to think and go around that concept of what are these kind of hubs and corridors. This is the integration of Peninsular Florida, the Appalachians, which is their Nature's Network in the Northeast, and the South Atlantic Blueprint, integrating their hubs and corridors from all of those. There are hubs and corridors in development for Western area, and so working on filling those in as that becomes available. So just starting on building out just the hubs and corridors part of that network. The other thing I've been spending a while on is particularly fun is trying to integrate a bunch of these ecosystem assessments that have been out there. So, part of this broader Southeast strategy and even in the South Atlantic, what did we ask? Well, okay, what's the current condition of the ecosystems right now? Where are we trying to get them to? And then the blueprint then being that spatial plan for how we get there. And so we haven't done yet is at the broader Southeast level, okay, well, what is the current condition of the ecosystems of the Southeast, and where are we trying to get them to? So that is a high priority within the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, and so as part of that, been integrating the assessments we have that try to get at that. Here are 5 of the subregional assessments, so within the Southeast, that we've kind of pulled together so far. So things like the Chesapeake Bay Report Card, Everglades Restoration, Tennessee River Basin, State of the South Atlantic, Mississippi River Watershed Report Card. So these are all data-driven assessments. And so I've kind of pulled together some of those scores. Here's a quick kind of spatial view of what those areas cover. I don't have the files exactly for the Everglades yet, so just imagine a little area over the Everglades. And I'm also working on getting a hold of a soon-to-be-released report card for the Texas Gulf Coast. So that is also on the way, and I will fold those results in as they come in. So this is really to set up kind of the current state and inform some goal setting for the broader Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. There are also these national/regional assessments. Often the national ones have kind of regional breakouts of what's going on. And so the EPA Rivers and Streams Assessment, Coastal Condition, National Fish Habitat Partnership Assessments, the Forest Service's Future Forest and Rangelands, State of the Birds, a number of these kind of assessments. And so we've also pulled information and scores from those. So trying to get at, okay, well, what are they telling us about the condition, and also the trajectory of where those scores seem to be going. So fun stuff. A few observations so far after pulling all these things together. The subregional assessments are typically scoring ecosystem condition lower than these national assessments. So on the average subregional score, we average them all together, is about 47 out of 100. The average regional assessment score is about 61. And so there's a number of reasons, I think. Got a few theories for that related to what ecosystems they're going after and how they set their baselines. But that is fairly interesting that these subregional scores tend to be a little bit lower. The assessments of aquatic condition, be they subregional or regional, tend to be relatively stable. So here's an example, the Chesapeake Bay Report Card up to 2016. It's likely to actually look a little bit better, I think, given the last few what I've been hearing out of the Chesapeake for the recent years. But in general, we have relatively stable to even possibly improving. So this is what the Chesapeake is telling us. Now let's look at the coastal condition assessment. So I've broken this down into 2 regions. The South Atlantic is the top one in blue. The bottom one, or the lower scored one in red, is the Gulf, and this is showing across 3 years of the coastal condition assessment. And the middle one is basically the average of the 2, kind of covering the full region. And you say it's relatively stable across that about 10-year period. And so, both sub-regional and regional assessments roughly giving similar kind of trends. So that was fairly interesting. And the last piece, I would say, out of the observations from that is that the grassland and open pine systems are seeing more decline than upland hardwoods and forested wetlands. Just overall, looking at the sort of combining across a few of these. Here's an example. This is now national, not local. I'll show you some local stuff in a second. From the State of the Birds on looking at population trends from different birds. You see wetland birds are actually starting to improve. Forest birds are getting better, but still lower nationally. And then grassland birds are still really in trouble. Their declines are not increasing, but they're still really relatively much more in trouble than they've been before. So we'll dig in a little bit deeper to that. for the southeast. So that was fairly interesting, and that we obviously putting a lot of effort into open pine and grassland kind of work in this geography. So I took a look at breeding bird survey trends for the southeast and just pulled out some of the most broadly shared bird species within those different habitats, just to get a quick sense of what's going on in the south. And interestingly, those kind of State Wildlife Action Plan swap priority upland hardwood and forest wetland bird populations in the southeast tended to be stable or even increasing. And so like things like wood thrush, prothonotary warbler, Louisiana wild thrush, all those, pretty much everyone I hit tended to be relatively stable or increasing. The increasing ones are water thrush and worm-eating warbler. But then when you break out these priority grassland and open pine birds, basically almost all of them are declining. So bobwhite quail, Bachman sparrow, grasshopper sparrow, all of those, every single one over the last 10 years. And I wasn't cherry picking these either. I just basically went down the list of, okay, what are these broadly shared Wildlife Action Plan priority bird species? And every single one in the upland hardwood and forest or wetlands was stable or increasing, and every single one in grassland open pine was declining. So seems like preliminarily in some of these assessments we got more work to do. We're putting a lot of effort in grassland open pine. It seems like we need to keep putting even more effort in there. So those are some interesting stuff that came from those assessments so far. Okay, on to threats. The other component, what we don't have so far, we have in the South Atlantic blueprint, we've got some threat layers we have that's consistent across the South Atlantic. But what we've been working now for the full Southeast is trying to have some integrated threat layers across the entire South, right? And so figuring out ways to merge together models of sort of urbanization, sea level rise, and stream flow alteration, climate change. What's the best integrated layer if you need to use something across the entire South? And so you could have that to download and use. The most immediate use right now, as far as real practical uses of those threats, is for the huge avalanche of species assessments that are going down and having some consistent way of looking at threats across a whole bunch of different species status assessments. So that was one of the big uses that was the reason for the request of these integrated threat layers. So I haven't really started a lot on those, just listing out a few that are a possibility and figuring out how to best put them together, or what's the best single layer to use. So that's threats, again, another thing coming this fall. And as usual, when stuff is ready and online, we'll get them up to you. You don't have to wait for some grand release at the end of the year. Now, there are a bunch of other improvements in the works that I haven't talked about, and I'm not sure, how many of them are going to be ready for the fall update, which is why I didn't really capture a lot of them. One big one we've been working on and hopefully been ramping up pretty soon is finer resolution in the South Atlantic. So going down to, we've got some approaches. We think we can run the blueprint at finer resolutions with some of the indicators, and so we're going to be trying that out over the next few months and seeing how well it works. Also have a bunch of new and improved indicators in the works, updates to the regularly burned areas, greatly improved amphibian, reptile stuff, improved at-risk species things, improved migratory fish indicator, particularly incorporating historic ranges into it. So we got a lot of really cool stuff in the works, just not sure what, if any of them, are going to be ready for the fall updates. So there's a bunch of stuff in the works there. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, which has been particularly fun, that Simeon and our shop has been working a lot on, is some ways to better integrate threats and uncertainty into the blueprint and into some of the blueprint support that we're doing. Now, some of you that were at the 2015 blueprint workshops, you might remember these strategy maps that we did near the end, where we looked at the blueprint and looked at priority places in the blueprint and then looked at places that were likely to change due to sea level rise or urbanization, or less likely to change by 2050. So we had this map. The yellows were urbanization potential by 2050. The blues were sea level rise potential by 2050, and then the rest of that pinkish color were ones that were a priority in the blueprint but not predicted to change. So these are all blueprint priorities. And really this is trying to get at the question of, what is our allocation across the whole broader conservation community, across these sort of what we call these high urgency type folks, folks that are like, hey, these places are changing, and so they're particularly important. We need to those are a higher priority for us to go and work because those are the ones rapidly changing. So that's called sort of high urgency strategy, all the way down to the lower risk type folks, which are sort of like, well, here's what I do is I look at those places that are changing and I get as far away from them as possible, and I want to go for the places that aren't likely to change. And so might have remembered if you were there, or you probably heard me talk about it, we went through a chip voting exercise. So everyone as individuals, hundreds of folks from really broad swath of the conservation community put in their vote for, I want to be part of this lower risk, or I don't want to work in the blue or the yellows, or I want to go part in the high urgency. I think it's even more important to work in those. So we got our allocation out of that, and that's sort of the current, I think it's the best assessment and most across such a broad group of folks that I've ever heard of being done, and it gives us a nice baseline to start on sort of our balance of high urgency versus low risk kind of effort. So in the end, we came up with our strategy votes. So these are the votes on the different components from lower risk at the top in blue all the way down to the higher urgency in green, and some points in between. So that was kind of our current condition. How are we spread out to manage risk across all these different organizations in the South Atlantic? But the intent really was to kind of say, okay, what's that baseline? And then, what's the optimal balance across these sort of high urgency, low risk areas? Is this the right balance? Should we be, seeing if folks can concentrate on maybe a little more of their effort in lower risk, or maybe more of their effort in higher urgency? What's the best way to go? And so what we've been doing recently is looking to economics and something called modern portfolio theory to address this question of how you deal with this balance of risk and returns. And so, you think about something that's got a long history of having to deal with risk. Investments, and a lot of folks, probably everyone on the line has some kind of retirement fund that sits along this balance. And so it's looking at that sort of question of how do you balance risk and return? How do you incorporate risk when you're thinking about investment? So this portfolio theory is something that Simeon and I and a few folks are looking into how we might use it at different scales in the blueprint itself. So this chart here is looking at sort of diversification. So this idea going back to I think 1977 to 2011, looking at returns and a mixed balance of sort of stocks and bonds. And on the x-axis, you have the risk that you're not going to get with the average return. And on the y-axis, you have the average return. And so this is what you're kind of balancing, right? Risk versus return. And so stocks are more riskier than bonds, but they give a higher return. And so this is looking at different mixes of investments across that frontier, and trying to figure out what's the most efficient place to be at. So this is a lot of how economists look at this investment question, and it really focuses on the different risks and how they balance each other out. And so this is something we're looking into with the blueprint itself, because it's not just about the risks, but also how they relate to each other. That tells you where the sweet spot's going to be. So we're investigating some of this, expect to see a little more as we start trying out some pilot areas, and look at that allocation. So you think about a high urgency is kind of like investing in a stock, high risk, high return. A lower risk strategy is more like a bond, where you're going to get potentially a lower return, but at a lower risk. So that's a little quick taste of what we're looking into for the blueprint, not just holistically as far as the blueprint having the right balance of kind of high urgency versus low risk kind of places, and how do you deal with these multiple interacting sources of uncertainty. But we're also working on testing it as a parcel level tool to help deal with this challenge of incorporating threats and uncertainty into more detailed local questions. This is some parcels we're testing it out with. This is south of Conway, South Carolina, within Horry County. These are all sort of large 150-acre plus parcels that we're testing that out, looking at sort of return, cost of the parcel, but also two interacting threats to conversion to cropland and threats to conversion for urban growth. So we're starting to pilot this out really thinking about it at the big scale for the blueprint, but also piloting it out to help with smaller parcel level decisions and incorporating uncertainty as well. So fun stuff. So that is my whirlwind tour of stuff in the fall update, and also a little bit of stuff in the works for future improvements.
Awesome. Thanks, Rua. Does anybody have any questions? It's only 10:30, so we have plenty of time. Quiet bunch this morning. I'll wait one more time. All right, well, hearing none, I'll go ahead and move on with a preview of next month's webinar, and then we'll pause again for questions at the end if something occurs to you in the meantime. And so let me put my slides back on here. So next month, we're going to have a web forum about rare species in the longleaf pine ecosystem. That's going to be June 21st, same time, same connection information as today. Brian Crawford with the University of Georgia will be given that talk. And he's basically providing an update on his project to accelerate conservation of at-risk species in longleaf. So his project is developing range-wise models for 5 species of herps, including gopher tortoise, gopher frog, southern hognose snake, striped newt, and Florida pine snake. So he'll give us an update on the draft models and the progress so far. He spoke to us about a year ago with sort of his plan for this project, so it'll be great to hear some more of where that is. A couple of quick updates from your Blueprint staff. Rua's presentation today really focused on the Blueprint data, but I also wanted to highlight a couple of updates on how the Blueprint is being used as well. If you read the newsletter, you've probably seen a couple blogs on that subject in the newsletter that went out a couple weeks ago. So first, some numbers on Blueprint use. We try to keep track of the ways that people are using the Blueprint so we can better understand how it should be improved to meet their needs. And we found that more than 100 people from 45 different organizations either have used or are in the process of using the Blueprint, and that the Blueprint has informed at least $19.7 million of conservation investment, 99% of which supported on-the-ground actions like acquisition and incentives and management. And keep in mind, with all of these numbers, we're only counting the examples we know about, and we do know that plenty of people have used the Blueprint on their own without help from staff. So these are all conservative estimates, and we're pretty excited about how many people have been incorporating the Blueprint into their actions and decision-making. The other thing I wanted to touch on, Rua and I are also working on an online guide to using the Blueprint. We mentioned this and got into it at length on last month's web forum about using the Blueprint to inform your proposals. So you can kind of think of this guide as a compilation of different examples to inspire you and provide new ideas about how you can connect to the Blueprint. We've been supporting Blueprint users for years now, and we've learned a lot about the types of approaches and the wording and the maps that tend to be most helpful in different situations. So this guide is going to showcase some detailed case studies, and we'll group them into themes summarizing basically the primary ways that people have used the Blueprint, like supporting proposals for funding, using metrics to report out on the impacts of their conservation actions. A lot of people have used it to kind of help tell the unique story of why their area of interest is important. So if you look at the blog I wrote on this that's featured on the homepage of the South Atlantic LCC website, it does include kind of a sneak peek showing a case study of a coastal wetlands grant that we supported back in 2016. So I encourage you to check that out and stay tuned for future newsletters. We're probably going to release a few more examples as we work on the main guide. And then lastly, I always end on this slide, how to get more involved. Please join the South Atlantic LCC web community. That'll get you signed up for our newsletter and a reminder email about this monthly web forum. You're always welcome to reach out to staff, so that's me and Rua and Amy and Mallory and the rest of the crew here in Raleigh, or reach out to other members of the cooperative. And then, of course, I encourage you to explore the Conservation Blueprint online. Check it out, download the data. And that's really it for today. So I'll pause for questions one more time. Just remember you can hit *6 to unmute. All right, short and sweet today. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'll let you go and hope to see you in June. Bye everybody.